Hey rail fans, today we're at the workbench because we're going to be upgrading 9349 to DCC with sound. This is a Proto 2000 Alco S-3 Switcher that I bought a couple of years ago as DC. And then when I first got into DCC, I bought a Bachmann decoder with a 8-pin plug just to see what DCC was about. So now today we're going to upgrade it to sound. And what we're going to do is install a Soundtraxx Tsunami TSU-750 and a 1/2-inch speaker. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing that we need to do is we need to separate the shell and the frame. On this particular type of locomotive, the way to do that is you need to remove the fuel tank assembly, which just presses on. And what I do is I just take a flat blade screwdriver and work it in underneath and just gently pry that off, because you don't want to cause any damage, especially to these plastic parts. So once you get that off, it's going to reveal two screws that hold the frame and the shell together. So what you just need to do is, there's a screw and there's a screw, so just take those screws out. Another thing that you need to do in order to separate the frame and the shell, especially on this model of locomotive, you need to take the coupler boxes off on the front and the rear of the locomotive. Otherwise, this opening here is not big enough in order for that to lift out. So just take a screwdriver, take the coupling or coupler boxes out, and the shell will separate from the frame. When you do this, you need to make sure that you remove the whole coupler box and not just the coupling, because if you don't take the coupler box out, there's not going to be enough clearance between the shell and its narrow opening there on the front and the back in order to get this out. So make sure you take the whole coupler box out, and we're going to be reinstalling this when we get done with the upgrade, so we're just going to set that aside and keep that for later. Now this shell should just lift right off of there, and you can see it's starting to separate from the frame. That's just going to lift right off of there. As you can see, this is from previous installations. Is it a mess? Not entirely. Is it clean? Yeah, it could be better, and that's what we're going to do today once we put the sound decoder in there. But what we need to do is we need to start stripping this down to the motor and the frame so we can get that new decoder in there. Okay, we're going to reuse some of these parts, especially these LED lights that I already have installed. So we're just going to start pulling things apart one thing at a time here, because so the LED lights I'm going to use again. We're just going to peel that stuff off of there. And once you start to get to the guts or the components of it, this stuff will come apart pretty easy. One of the things I wanted to show you while we were doing this, because remember I said I bought this as a DC, even though I put a Bachmann decoder in it. See underneath here, this is where the 8-pin plug is. This is the original board that was in it when I bought it, and you can see that the 8-pin plugs here just go right down into that socket. And when I bought this Bachmann 8-pin plug, you just pull this out. It's held in by one screw underneath there, and then you just plug in the Bachmann decoder right into that 8-pin plug there. Now all this is going to come out so that we can get the sound decoder in, so we're going to start to remove some wires. Start taking these pieces apart here, and like I say, I want to reuse some of this stuff, so I don't want to damage it in the process. This 8-pin plug is just going to pull right out of there. See how easy that separates? I doubt if I'm ever going to use this decoder again. It does work in DCC, but it's motor control only, but I doubt if I'm going to use that. Now you can see the wire attachments here. These are held on with rubber caps or plastic caps that helps hold your wire in there. So we're just going to pull these off one at a time, and these wires are going to separate. Like I say, I want to save the lights, so pull the lights off. I'm going to set them aside so we can use them again. If you're using these types of lights, which these are Evan Design LED, and you can see they already have a resistor built in, you need to be careful. One, the wires are extremely small. Two, they use a solid wire in underneath that insulation. They don't use braided wire. If you flex or bend these too much, you can break them, so you need to be careful when you're working with them. And you can see how that 8-pin connector just easily comes out of there. I'm going to set that aside, probably put that in the part box, because you never know when you might need something. All these little plastic caps, the same thing there. We'll just go ahead and set those aside for now. We're getting there. We're almost down to the components. I put this piece of electrical tape on the top here because I wanted to make sure that if for some reason we had a bare wire or a bare spot in the wire, that we didn't have any shorts. Plus also, since that 8-pin connector sat on top of here, this is metal, so I put basically electrical tape as an insulator between that metal frame and the contacts on that 8-pin connector. As you're taking this apart, you need to start paying attention to the wiring that's on your locomotive, because if they use NMRA color coding for the wiring, you can start to figure out where things are. But one of the things that I noticed as I'm watching here is the red is supposed to be the right rail pickup, which this is the front of the locomotive and this is the rear. Actually, this red should be on the opposite side of the loco here. As you notice that they got the black wires. So we'll fix this stuff as we go along, but you need to pay attention to the wiring as you're starting to take this stuff apart. So to take this apart, it's pretty easy. First thing I'm going to do is take the plastic truck covers off so I can take the wire feeds off for the positive and negative, and once I get this off, you'll see how easy this is. This is your electrical pickup for the left side, which that wire will just pull out of there. So for consistency, once I put this back together, I will make sure that the red is on the right pickup and the black is on the left pickup. And now you can see the wires that we have left. We've got the gray and the orange wire for the motor pickups. This screw and this screw hold the top portion of the frame to the bottom portion of the frame, and we need to take those apart so that we can get at the motor, because one of the things with DCC is we need to make sure that the motor is isolated from the frame and that the decoder is only getting its electrical pickup from the left and the right leads. So once we take these screws out, the top portion of the frame is going to lift right off of the bottom, and you can see now that we have access to the motor. Now in order to get the motor out, there is a screw on the bottom. So once we loosen or take that screw out, the motor assembly is going to lift right out of there so that we can get to the bottom of it. And there we have separated the motor from the bottom part of the frame. You can see here getting its electrical pickup from the bottom. We're going to have to relocate this orange wire that's on the top part of the frame so that we can isolate that motor. Plus what we're going to need to do is we're just going to put electrical tape in here to isolate the motor from the frame. You can see we've already got a tab right there that we can solder onto, so we'll go ahead and get that going. Okay, what I'm going to do for the motor connections is, this is the top of the motor, and you can see they have a gray wire connected here. When you're doing decoders, standard color coding is the orange is supposed to be on the top and gray is supposed to be on the bottom. And you can see the wiring from the decoder. I have sufficient wire, so to eliminate yet another solder connection, I am just going to take that wire off of there and eliminate that altogether. And to do that, since these plastic housings are insulators, I don't want to take a chance on melting this stuff. I'm just going to take that nut off of there, which is going to separate the electrical contact there. That way I don't take a chance on melting that stuff while I'm doing the soldering. So all we need to do is loosen that up. And you need to be careful while you're doing this, because there are springs that provide tension underneath. So just loosen that up. Once you get it loose, you should be able to use your fingers to take that out of there. And you see that just lifts right up out of there. That spring goes up inside of that shaft, which provides tension for the electrical contact. So be careful when you're taking this stuff apart. You can see that that electrical contact is going to come right off of there. Okay, now I can make my solder connection on there, and without chance of melting that plastic housing. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do one at a time, so I don't get confused and messed up on which is the top and the bottom and the orange and the gray. Since I only have so many hands to do soldering, I'm just going to get some needle nose pliers here, and I'm going to slide that electrical connection over the top or the tip of the needle nose pliers, and that's just going to hold that for me while I desolder that. See how quick that was? I've changed up to a clothespin here to help hold that in place a little bit. And one of the things when you're soldering, you need to make sure that the solder that you use on your electrical connections is solder that's designed for that. You don't want to use plumbing solder for your electrical connection, because they're different chemical based, and you may not get a good hold on it. Now, one of the things that I like to do when I'm soldering is I like to put a little bit of solder on the tip of the iron. Okay, I've got a little bead on there because I've only got so many hands to work with. I get the wire that I want to solder, and I'm just going to dip this into the flux. Got a little bit of flux on there, you don't need a whole lot. Because once the solder starts to melt, you want it to flow smoothly on there. So what we'll do is we'll hold this on here. Should take about a split second to get that heated up and melted. Let it cool down for a couple of seconds. There you can see we've got a nice decent solder connection on there. We're just going to quickly put this back together. Okay, we have that connected together, so what we're going to do is we're just going to bend that contact down so that it's out of the way, and we're going to turn it over, take the bottom one off, and solder our gray wire onto that. And here you can see our electrical connections for the top and the bottom of the motor. We've got everything put back into place, so we're ready to go to the next step. Now this is going to sit back in the frame right here, so I need to make sure that the frame is isolated. I'm going to put electrical tape in there, but if you notice on the electrical contact for the bottom of the motor, there's a chance that it can rub against the side of the frame there, so I'm going to file that down, a little hole opening in there, so that sits nice and snug. We've got the motor leads connected, and now as you can see, I made a groove in that area of the frame there because that's where the lead or the contact was for the bottom of the motor, and as soon as we solder it together, of course we increase the area of it. So in order to make room for that bead of solder, I made a little opening there. Now our next step would be to isolate that, so we're going to put some electrical tape in there. Make sure that no chance of contact of any kind. Then we'll trim this electrical tape up and make it look really nice and neat. Okay, we have our piece of electrical tape in that area there underneath the motor to make sure that we don't have any contact with that frame. See, I've left a little gap there. Now this motor should drop right down in there. Top and bottom motor connections isolated. We're ready for the next step. We're going to put the top part of the frame back on. We'll screw that in place. We don't need this orange wire anymore. Now that the top of the frame is in place, we'll go ahead and turn this over. We will put the screw in the bottom of the motor. Right in place. We've got our motor connections. This decoder is going to sit right in that spot there. The speaker is going to go in the back here. That used to be the pocket for the rear light. I'm going to remove that so that the baffle for the speaker sits in there, and we really don't need that anymore. Now, one thing I need to mention, you see me filing and grinding and stuff. You see I've filed off that little base there for that rear light assembly. One thing you need to remember, metal filings within these small motors and gears are a problem. So when I get done, I clean in all the metal filings out. I use a air hose on low pressure because you don't want to blow things out, to clean it out, and then I take and run a magnet across there to make sure that I've got all the stuff out. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to put the electrical pickups on the trucks back in there, feed the wires up through the holes that are in the top part of the frame, and continue. Notice on these electrical pickups on the trucks, they have these little plastic clips on there just like the 8-pin connector. What we're going to do is we're going to take those off there, and we're going to solder the wires on because we want to make sure we've got good electrical contacts. And the best way to do that is to hardwire, solder your contacts on there. I've already soldered 3 of the electrical pickups on the trucks, but just to give you the basic concept of what I'm doing here, like I said earlier, I like to put a bead of solder on the tip of the soldering iron. I'm going to take the wire and I'm going to dip it in the flux. Okay. I'm going to hold it on there. I'm going to touch that bead to the connection and watch it solder. Nice connection. It's going to feed up through the frame to the decoder. Now remember, black is the left side, so black is going to go on this side because this is the front here. So we'll just feed this up through the truck. Want to make sure that we feed it up through the hole for the wire. The wire fed up through, we can attach this truck or electrical pickup to the truck, and we'll go ahead and do that for the other three. And to keep things from falling apart, we'll go ahead and put our plastic cover on. This is just gonna slip in there. Clip together. Okay, we've got all our electrical pickups on the trucks. We've got the plastic covers to hold them in place. You can see we've got our wires fed up through the holes. Now the next thing is we're going to go ahead and mount the decoder, which the decoder is going to go right in here. I'm going to use double-sided tape for that, and we'll stick that in there, and it should hold it in place while we make our soldering connections. Okay, what we'll do is we'll just tear off a piece of double-sided tape. We don't need a whole lot. I'm not going to use the thick foam double-sided tape for this because being mounted on right on top of this frame is also going to help with heat dissipation. So then just put a piece of two-sided tape. We're going to lay that right in the middle. Just going to press in, hold into place. Now you don't want to put a whole lot of pressure on that when you press that into place, because it's liable to cause the decoder to malfunction or do things you don't want it to do. Strip the insulation back on the red pickup wires, and now what I'm going to do is connect the red wire for the decoder onto the two pickup wires. Okay, what we'll do is we'll put a little bit of flux on that connection there. Because we want to make sure that the solder flows. I've already got a bead of solder on my soldering iron, so as soon as we touch that, it should flow together. Now once that cools down and I get all the connections taken care of, I have some liquid tape that we'll put on there to prevent any kind of electrical short. Finished up the solder connections for the left and right pickup. What I'm going to do is take some of this liquid tape and I'm going to insulate those lines. Now granted, there's a pretty big dauber inside of here and I don't need a whole lot, so I'm going to use a toothpick or scrap piece of wood I got laying on the workbench here to apply this. Basically what I'm going to do is just use this piece of wood here, dab a little bit on the tip, and then I'm going to brush it on the electrical connection. Somewhat smooth and thick. You know, I'm not looking for thickness of house insulation, but I do want to cover up the bare spot so we don't have any shorts underneath there. And then when I get done doing this, I'm just going to set this aside so that this will dry, and because I need to start preparing the cab and the shell, we'll set this aside and then we're going to go ahead and work on the shell. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this apart so that we can get to the inner components. Okay, we've got that separated because what we need to do is I need to get the cab apart. Since we're limited for space on these S3s, I'm going to need to put the capacitor in the cab here, and also I want to redo the backup light because I'm not happy with the way they have it with that clear tube. I'm going to try and conceal that a little bit better. Okay, I've got the cab apart, and like I said, what I need to do is I need to make an opening here to fit that capacitor, and I'm just going to cut that out. It's not going to be a whole lot to it. And on the underside of the cab for the backlight, I'm just going to go ahead and take that piece of plastic out that reflects the light from underneath the cab, because we're going to replace that. That's going to get tossed aside. Removing this, you're not going to notice it anyway, because not very many people can see inside of these cabs. So I'm just going to cut this out. So what we'll do is we'll get a two-sided tape, tear off a piece just big enough to fit in there so that we can lay that capacitor on there. Here's the capacitor. It comes separate from the sound decoder. You need to wire it up. What we'll do is we'll lay that in there so that we'll be able to get to the prongs to solder them. Now, as far as the cab, I'm going to take one of the lights that we took out earlier, and I'm just going to insert it in the hole where the old lens used to be. See what I said about those wires being delicate? See how delicate those wires are. So what I did is I cut the insulation off of that capacitor, and what I'm going to do is grab a piece of electrical tape and cover that up and re-insulate it, because what I did is I actually just soldered the wire back onto the back. So we'll just go ahead and make our own insulation. Got a piece of two-sided foam tape or double-sided foam tape, stuck it on the roof, and you can see I have attach the wires to the double-sided tape. The light is sticking out of the rear there. So all we'll need to do is wire that up to the decoder, and since it's on the reverse, it's going to be the yellow and the blue. But before I wire that up, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the shell back together. Should take a couple of minutes. We're just going to piece things back together. The shell back together. Now getting the front lens out for the LED light is going to be relatively easy, because this just pops in place. See that fall right out of there? And once we get our other LED light, this is just going to insert into that hole. That slid right in there. Up the front headlight, one of these is going to go to white, the other one is going to go to blue, so we'll go ahead and get those soldered together. So just like before, we'll get a little bit of flux. We'll put it on our wire. See, it doesn't take a whole lot. Get our soldering iron. We're just going to touch these wires, touch this. We have 3 wires that need to be connected together and also connected to the capacitor. So we got a wire from the front light, a wire from the back light, and the blue wire, which is the common wire. So we'll solder those together and then we'll go ahead and solder them to the capacitor. Flux. A little bit of solder. That'll hold those 3 wires together so that we can get them onto the capacitor. Yeah, this is going to be fast and furious without melting any plastic. Okay, we need to get the green and the yellow one onto the other capacitor connector. So once again, fast and furious, try not to melt any plastic. Okay, for the speaker installation, what I did is I took the baffle and I made a hole with the X-Acto knife so that the wires will fit down through there. And then after I get the wires through there, I'm going to go ahead and seal that with some of that liquid tape so that the sound waves from the back don't interfere with the sound waves from the speaker. So it should be relatively easy to fit those down into that hole there. We have the wire started through the hole, so now we're just going to feed that through there. Should press right down into place. See, the speaker is up against the front. Put the back on. Should snap right into place. Okay. Now the speaker is going to sit right here, and I'm going to use 2-sided tape to hold it down. The purple wires are for sound, so we'll get those soldered together. We have 2 more sets of wires that need to be connected. We've got the yellow wire, which is for the rear light, and we've got the 2 purple wires, which is for the speakers. So we'll go ahead and get that taken care of right now. Now for the speaker wires, and I'm just going to put some flux on both of those wires right now. Should have these soldered up here in a couple of seconds. When you're soldering speaker wires, if you're only using one speaker, it doesn't matter which wire goes on. Okay, now that we have all the wires hooked up and I have them all solder connections insulated with that liquid tape, I'm going to go ahead and test it to see if it works. I don't have my command station. I had to send it back to the shop because the short circuit protection failed. I'm going to use a DC power pack. Now, one thing with Tsunamis is they are shipped with the analog disabled. That means it doesn't work in DC unless you program the CVs for it to work in that. So when I turn on this power pack, I should get the red pilot light, and I should at least get sound. I won't be able to move it, and I won't be able to turn any lights on, but the pilot light will indicate that I've got power and everything is hooked up right. There you can see the red pilot light. come on in the back there. We do in fact have sound, so things seem to be working correctly. Hopefully within a couple of days I'll get my command station back and we'll be able to move it forward and back and turn the lights on and make sure that everything's hooked up. But I wanted to at least check and make sure that we had power and good connections before I put the shell back on there. Okay, we're going to finish up this installation. All we need to do is tuck the wires back in underneath the shell and we'll be ready to go. This is going to fit right down on top of there. Okay, you can see we've got everything back together as far as the shell and the frame. So now what we need to do is we need to put the fuel tank assembly and the coupler boxes back on. Put the mounting screws. I got my command station back from the shop, it's hooked up, checked out, make sure everything's okay. So what I want to do now is check and make sure that the decoder performs under DCC conditions. You saw we had sound before and some lights. Now I want to make sure that the movement is okay. So let's go ahead and start it up. Sounds pretty good so far. Turn on the headlights. I've already started to program some of the CVs. That's the low beam. That's the high beam. You can see how bright those LEDs are. I think for a switcher I'm going to keep it in the low beam. Bell sounds pretty good. Horn doesn't sound too bad. Okay, let's give it a try in reverse. I'm going to turn the bell off. Well, lights and the direction seem to be working okay. Sound seems to be fine. So I think we can call this one complete. As always, thanks for watching.